All right, shall we start? Okay, I'd like to welcome you all. My name is Metin Atmaca. I am an associate professor of Ottoman and Iranian history at the Social Sciences University of Ankara, and also a faculty member at the Zahra Institute. I'd like to welcome you. Happy New Year, Navroz Pirozbeh to you all. Today we will host Sacha Alsancakli from the University of Muenster. And this is our third speaker series that has started in February with the famous singer Roshan, Kurdish singer, and in February we had Michael Brill, Princeton University, and the third one will be Sacha Alsancakli, and the next one we have two more actually upcoming in April. On April 3rd, Jin Bajalan of Missouri State University, and the final one will be held with Nilay Özok Gündoğan of Florida State University on May 1st. I'd like to introduce you Dr. Alsancakli before we go ahead with his talk. He's currently a postdoctoral research associate at the Institute of Arabic and Islamic Studies at the University of Muenster in Germany. He's focusing on, he's working actually in a project called Inner Islamic Transfer of Knowledge within Arabic, Persian, Ottoman translation process in Eastern Mediterranean from 1400 to 1750s. He received his PhD in Oriental Languages and Civilizations from Sorbonne Nouvelle University in Paris in 2018. And his doctoral dissertation naturally was on Sharaf Khan Bitlis's Sharafnāma, an excellent work actually he has done. As a cultural historian of the early modern Turco-Iranian world, notably Kurdistan, he researches historiography and history of the book through the actors and processes involved in production and circulation of manuscript texts. He has worked as a lecturer at Sorbonne Nouvelle University from 2019 to 2021 and Institut National des Langues et Civilisations Orientales since 2021. I believe you are teaching in Kurdish Studies department there at INALCO. And he had several chapters and articles published in journals such as Eurasian Studies, Kurdish Studies Journal, and the Welt des Islam. He hasn't mentioned in his biography, but he's also one of the editors, I think book review editors for Kurdish Studies Journal published by Brill. His talk will be about language in the Sharafnāma and what Sharafnāma can tell us about the linguistic situation in early modern Kurdistan, discussing the origins of Kurdish language as described by Sharaf Khan, his vision of Kurdish, the use of Kurdish in book, and the question of his own abilities in Kurdish. Welcome again, Dr. Alsancakli.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Metin, for the kind introduction. And of course, thanks to everyone at the Zahra Institute for having me in this great speaker series. And as Metin mentioned, Happy New Year, Navroz Pirozbeh again. So we'll just share my screen. Okay. Is it good? Can you see it?
Yeah, great.
All right. So my talk of today is on the Sharafnāma as a case study in the Ecolinguistics of Kurdistan. So very briefly, the Sharafnāma is a Persian chronicle written in 1597 by Sharaf Khan, the Emir of Bitlis, which is a Kurdish emirate to the southwest of Lake Van. You can see a map here. It's on the far left corner. At the time, this is, we can say, the most, or at least one of the most powerful emirates in Kurdistan. Sharaf Khan is the son of Shamsuddin Khan, who was himself briefly the emir of Bitlis before being forced into exile in Safavid Iran. And his mother was a granddaughter of Amir Khan Mausulu, a former Akoyimlu governor of Diyarbakir, and later guardian and seal bearer of Shah Tahmasp. So this is a sort of summary of the life and career of Sharaf Khan. There's a little map next to it. So basically, Sharaf Khan was born in exile, as I said, near Qom in 1543. He was educated in Shah Tahmasp's palace from the age of 9 to the age of 12, approximately. And then he spent about a dozen years as a Safavid military commander, notably in Gilan and Shirvan around the Caspian Sea, as you can see on the map. Finally, he rallied the Ottomans at the beginning of the war of 1578-1590, the war between the Ottomans and the Safavids. And from then on, he was emir of Bitlis until his demotion in 1596. Then he rebelled against the Ottomans because of this demotion, and he ended up being killed approximately in 1600, the end of 1600 or the beginning of 1601. Now, the Sharafnāma consists of a dibache, or a preface, a muqaddimeh, introduction, 4 books that are called sahife, and a khatimeh, or an epilogue. The muqaddimeh is devoted to the genealogy and customs of the Kurds in general, while the 4 books chronicle the history of 47 Kurdish emirates from medieval times to the date of the work's composition, which is in 1597, as already mentioned. And the Khatimeh has a different subject altogether, as it deals with Ottoman and Iranian history without particular focus on the Kurds. So this is these are a few slides on the structure of the Sharafnāma. You can see that basically each chapter is devoted to a dynasty, and they are categorized with the most important dynasties first, and then semi-independent dynasties in the second book, and then the rest of the dynasties. And of course, the 4th book is on the emirs of Bitlis themselves, and the Kurdish chronicle ends with the autobiography of the author, Sharaf Khan himself. This is the autograph manuscript of the Sharafnāma, which is held in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, with the call number Elliot 332. This is actually a later folio that was added to replace some missing folios at the beginning, but this is the original colophon of the autograph manuscript. This is a partially autographed manuscript, also held in Oxford's Bodleian Library and produced in August and September 1598. And this is another partially autographed manuscript produced in April-May 1599, held in St. Petersburg, and which served as the basis for the edition by Vladimir Veliaminov Zernov, which is the traditionally used edition nowadays. Now, the Sharafnāma is quite a familiar subject to me, as I have researched and discussed it for the better part of the last 15 years. And I think it might also be quite familiar to some of you. But it is a text of such richness that there always remain many unexplored and underexplored aspects of it. And today's talk will be devoted to one of these aspects, I believe, namely language in the Sharafnāma and what the Sharafnāma can tell us about the linguistic situation in early modern Kurdistan. I want to mention that this is part of a research undertaken in the framework of a new edition of the Sharafnāma, prepared by Mustafa Derkan and myself, and due to be published by the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna in spring 2025. So what I will be talking about, you will be able to find in the introduction of that edition. I also wanted to say a few words about the concept of ecolinguistics, in the framework of which I've tried to inscribe this research. So this concept goes back to the concept of ecology of language, defined by Einar Haugen in 1972 as the study of the interactions between any given language and its environment, referring both to the physical and the social environments. And in our case, we could even add textual environments. And it has been noted by researchers on this topic that language does not passively reflect reality. Instead, it actively creates reality. This is from M.A.K. Holiday's foundational article on the topic, and that the grammar and vocabulary also contribute to shaping experience and transforming our perceptions into meanings. Now, as you may have guessed, this is a concept that has mainly been used so far in contemporary discussions of multilingualism, language contact, language policy, but it certainly has great potential for historical study as well, as was evidenced by the work of Ludwig Paul, for example, on the linguistic ecology of the Ottoman Empire. And so I hope to further work on developing this concept concerning Kurdish in the early modern period. Now, moving on to the subject of the talk itself, I wanted to start with a quotation which is found in a preface to an Ottoman Turkish translation of the Sharafnāma. So this is a translation that was composed in the Emirate of Palu, the Diyarbakir region, in 1681. And the translator, Shami, starts by quoting from Ayah 22 of Quranic Surah 30, the Greeks, which talks about the diversity of languages. I can give you the English translation of A.J. Arbery of this Quranic quotation. It says, "And of his signs is the creation of the heavens and earth, the variety of your tongues and hues." You have the Ottoman Turkish text translation here. And so the idea for Shami is using that quotation is to introduce the topic of the diversity of languages and then having a little excursus on that topic. And so he says that it shall be known here that the variety of tongues refers to the various languages spoken among the creators, and he lists some of these languages: Arabic, Persian, Kurdish, Turkish, Greek, Hindi, Afghan, and many other tongues, he says. And then he gives a value judgment by saying that the most eminent of these tongues is Arabic, of course, because it is the language in which the Noble Quran was revealed. And after it, Persian, the sweetest of languages, which is something that you find often in this type of review of languages. It's considered a very sweet tongue because of all the poetry and everything. But then, and that's where it gets really interesting, he adds each people has considered their own language to be the highest after Arabic and Persian. And that is also the case of the Kurds. And he mentions that many great scholars, he names two of them, Imam Muhammad Barkali, Mullah Muhyiddin al-Jazari, which are two relatively unknown scholars. This Jazari, of course, has nothing to do with Malay Jazari, the very famous other scholar. And he says that they have chosen the Kurdish language, as well as many other authors, making it the most agreeable. And he adds, furthermore, that the bravest and most generous people of the Islamic community are the Arabs, of course, and then the Kurds. So I wanted to start, and you have the English translation here if you want to have a short look. Now, I wanted to start with this quote because for me it's quite interesting to read such a comment, which is obviously written with the aim to promote Kurdish, and even we could say includes an explicitly patriotic statement when Shami talks about the Kurds as the bravest and most generous of all people, save for the Arabs. But yet the Sharafnāma was written in Persian 80 years earlier, and this particular translation is done in Ottoman Turkish, not in Kurdish. In fact, at the same time, in Bitlis, you have another translation of the Sharafnāma that is produced at the request of the grandson of Sharaf Khan, the author. And this is also a Turkish translation. And the first Kurdish translation of the work appears only in the mid-19th century. It's done by Mullah Mahmoud Bayezidi, as you are probably aware. And it's not even a spontaneous project because he is requested to do it by August Jabba, which is, I think you all know, but an Orientalist of the time. So what I'm wondering, and what is kind of the basis for the problematic of this talk, is how can we resolve this apparent contradiction, meaning promoting Kurdish on the one hand, but then not writing in Kurdish, right? So to answer this question, I will first provide an overview of the linguistic situation of Kurdistan in the 16th, 17th centuries, which will help us, I think, understand why the Sharafnāma was written in Persian. And then I will evoke the question of language in the Sharafnāma through four interconnected aspects. Number one, the origins of the Kurdish language as described by Sharaf Khan. Number two, Kurdish as a sign of lack of adab in the Sharafnāma, lack of education, if you want. Number three, the mention of Kurdish words in the book, There are not many of them, but there are some of them. And number 4, the question of Sharafnāma's proficiency in Kurdish, so far as we can discuss it. Now, contrarily to a common misconception, Kurds throughout history have made extensive contributions to the intellectual advancement of the Islamic world. These contributions were, however, primarily made in the 3 dominant languages of the region, namely Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman Turkish. And this demonstrates how, in the words of the 19th century Turkish encyclopedist Shamseddin Sami, Kurdish authors and scholars had long neglected their own language, preferring to exert their efforts in Arabic and Persian. You have the full quotation here. This is part of the entry for Kurdish in that encyclopedia. And I think it is a good summary of the situation for the period. Indeed, for much of the medieval and early modern period, Kurdish essentially remained a spoken tongue, and despite its vibrant use of the local vernacular, it only marginally influenced the written languages of the region. And this is because these languages, Arabic, Persian, and to a lesser extent Turkish, were considered better suited for use in the arts and sciences and generally more prestigious. Now, this situation partially changed in the early 17th century and in the later periods, when Persian became increasingly foreign to the Ottoman Kurdish ruling class and was replaced by Turkish as the language of administration and correspondence with the Ottoman central powers in the Kurdish Emirates. And in turn, this paved the way for the advent of a Kurdish written literature, mainly consisting in poetry and didactical religious texts produced in the Kurdish madrasa context. And I think the names of people like Mirai Jazari, Taqiyya Tehran, Ahmed Khani are well known to you, as well as their works, so I will not dwell too much on this point. What is interesting for our purpose, however, is that these works generally present us, these Kurdish works generally present us with a different perspective on Kurdish society than books like the Sharafnāma. So in some of these texts written in Kurdish, notably Ahmed Khani's Memuzin or Taqiyya Tehran's Sher Dimdim, we can find a kind of primitive Kurdish patriotism, if we can call it that, and an associated rejection of the Ottoman and Safavid power. And that is a narrative that runs counter to the Kurdish emir's proactive role in the frontier politics of the 2 empires. Indeed, we can say that the Kurdish emirs benefited from the incessant wars between Ottomans and Safavids because it helped them strengthen their power, and we can actually see that their power, as soon as the wars are definitely over in the mid-17th century, their power actually starts to decrease. And so they benefited from these wars, and they had no interest in the kind of peace and unity among the Kurds that is explicitly promoted by Ahmed Khani in Memuzin, for example. Nor did they seem to care about the sufferings and hardships that these conflicts brought upon the common people. And this apparent disconnect between the princely elites on the one hand and the madrasa scholars on the other hand, who represented, broadly speaking, the educated class in Kurdish society, might also serve to explain, at least in part, the progressive decline of the hereditary Kurdish dynasts in favor of charismatic religious figures, as we will see them rise in the 19th century. Of course, this is a different subject, so I will not speak too much about that. Anyways, the relevant point to be understood here is that under these circumstances, it should come as no surprise that Sharaf Khan wrote the Sharafnāma in Persian rather than in Kurdish, which was presumably not even his native tongue. And we will come back to this. Yet, although it is quite natural, as we have shown, this language choice is not neutral, and it necessarily sways the author into at least partly aligning his vision of the Kurds with that of the Turco-Persian elites, which were the primary sponsors, authors, and readers of Persian and Turkish chronicles. And this is something that notably manifests in the author's vision of the Kurdish language and its origins. Now, the story of the origins of the Kurdish language in the Sharafnāma is closely related to the story of the origins of the Kurds themselves. Sharaf Khan presents us with 3 stories related to these Kurdish origins. All 3 are given in the Muqaddimah, the introduction of the work. In the first of these stories, taken from the Shahnameh by Abul Qasim Ferdowsi, the Kurds are presented as the offspring of the young man saved from the tyrant Zahra and sent to the mountains, wherein they ended up forming a separate people, speaking a separate tongue. And you have part of the story here on the screen. This is from the Sharafnāma. So Sharaf Khan writes that every day of the two young men to be executed for Zahak, one would be killed and the other would be set free, under the condition that he would leave his homeland, settle on the barren mountain tops where no man had ever set foot. And then after a while, a great number of people gathered there, and as the result of avoiding interaction with other people, they created their own language, that is the Kurdish language. And this is a story that is a bit expanded from what we find in the Shahnameh by Ferdowsi, but which is mostly in agreement with it. Now we have a second explanation for Kurdish origins, which is only found in the Sharafnāma, and it is that the Kurds are so called because of their bravery, and that is a wordplay between the name Kurd and the Persian word Gurd, brave, because of course at this time the differentiation between the K and the Gay is not actually made in the writing, or at least not very often. So there is also linguistic elements at play in that story, even though it does not specifically reference the Kurdish language. And then we have a third explanation in which the Kurds are said to be the offspring of divs, or demons, or geniuses, if you want. But here it is explicitly with a negative inference. And this is a reference to the story of the impious slave girls, assaulted by the demon Al-Jasad and chased away into the mountains by Solomon. A story which is found, for example, in the Golden Meadows by 10th century scholar Al-Mas'udi. And you have Al-Mas'udi's passage here. And you can see that the word chased away, as in when Solomon says, chase them away, Okruduhuna, is also given as a potential explanation for the name of the Kurds, Karada, Akrad, etc. But so what is interesting here is that in two of Sharaf Khan's explanations on the origins of the Kurds actually came together as a people by being exiled in the mountains and developing their unique tongue, Kurdish. And in this respect, the specific quality found in the story of the Kurdish language's emergence is that it is seen by people like Ferdowsi and Masudi as first and foremost a loss of language. And this language loss itself is a consequence of a separation from humanity and civilization. So for these and other classical authors, the Kurdish language is the mark of a civilizational defect, as it is by abandoning their original cultured tongues that Arabs or pre-Islamic Iranians become Kurds, and they also lose their civility in the process. And so it's interesting to see Sharaf Khan take up such stories in his book. In fact, the expression Akradi Div Nahad, or demon-like Kurds, along with similar metaphors that are prevalent in Persian and Ottoman chronicles of the time, and which are aimed at castigating the Kurds, is also used liberally by Sharaf Khan in the Sharafnāma. And this relates to what we said, meaning language as part and parcel of the constrained framework of thought in which the author can express himself. And so that means that in taking up stories by authors prejudiced against the Kurds, Sharaf Khan also unwillingly appropriates their anti-Kurdish ideological content, even though we can see from the story that he actually invented, the second story, which connects the Kurds with bravery, that he does actually try to also present the Kurds in the favorable lights. Now, this negative ideological vision of the Kurds and their language, prevalent in Persian and Ottoman literature at the time, also manifests in the way Kurdish speaking is presented in the Sharafnāma. Now, it's obvious that for the Emir of Bitlis, a people's language was closely associated with that people's nature and character, and this is also a common conception of the time. And the Kurdish character is described in other passages by Sharaf Khan as that of people with brave heart and free spirits, but ultimately composed of uncivilized hotheads lacking in adab. And this lack of adab, education, proper etiquette, is reflected in select passages wherein Kurdish speakers and Kurdish speaking are mentioned in the Sharafnāma. So, for example, we have a passage of the text in which Sharaf Khan describes a conversation held in Kurdish in the divan of Sultan Suleiman I in Istanbul, between three Kurdish individuals. One is the Rojikid Agha Mahmud Imadan Baigi. So the Rojikids are the tribesmen of the emirs of Bitlis, if you want. So one is the Rojikid Agha Mahmud Imadan Baigi. A second is Shamsuddin Khan, Sharaf Khan's father, and then the emir of Bitlis. And the third is Bakr Beg Ruzbahani, which was the Kurdish Sanjak Bey of Al-Jawaz, also in the Lake Van region, and presented here as the Agha of the servants of the city of Van. Now, I should specify here that although it is presented as being held in Kurdish, this conversation, as you can see on the screen, is actually transcribed in Persian in the book. The conversation starts with Mahmud Imadan offering to kill Suleiman's Grand Vizier, Targala Ibrahim Pasha, who is also present at the Divan, and whom he holds responsible for dispossessing his emir, Shamsuddin Khan, of the Emirate of Bitlis. And this is the root of the exile of Shamsuddin Khan that we discussed before. Shamsuddin Khan wisely rejects Mahmud Imadan's suggestion, and he is then cautioned by Bakr Beg not to act upon the advice of his ignorant Kurds, which will certainly rob him of any chance to recover his emirate, as it will most likely end up getting him killed. Now, in this episode, the Kurdish language and the knowledge thereof appear as a useful means of communication for the Rojikin men who can freely plot in the midst of the Sultan's Divan, and also as a marker of Kurdish ethnic solidarity in Istanbul with the intervention of Bakr Beg, which is a Kurd, but is also an appointed official of the Ottoman central power. So he's not part of the Kurdish, the network of Kurdish emirates. He's working for the Ottoman power. Sharaf Khan also highlights both the audacity of Mahmud Imadan's plan and its short-sightedness and foolhardiness. So in short, the Baigi tribesman is presented as a quintessential Kurd in Sharaf Khan's vision, and his noted use of Kurdish is to be understood in this context. Now, in another similar example, the author concludes his account of a discussion held in his grandfather, Sharaf Khan I's Divan in Bitlis, by attributing the latter's fateful decision to attack Ulama Beg Tekelu to the meaningless chatter and foolish postings of the Kurds. I say fateful decision because it will also end up getting Sharaf Khan I killed in that battle. So we can see here that whenever Kurdish speaking is mentioned, it is usually to indicate that something irrational, ignorant is being discussed. And such passages contribute to inform a depiction of tribal Kurds as frank and loyal, but ultimately irrational people. And whether explicitly mentioned or not, their language finds itself strongly associated with these characteristics. Sharaf Khan presents the Kurdish language as an essential component in his vision of an idealized and naive Kurdish life, and he never misses an opportunity to entertain the reader with anecdotes on various aspects of the idiom and its use among the Kurds. And this is where we have some Kurdish words that are being referenced in the work. So these Kurdish words are most frequently discussed in the context of proper names, including personal nicknames, such as, for example, Chafsor, furious, you could say, which is used as a nickname for Malik Khalaf of Hassan Kaifa. Kolus, somebody whose front teeth have fallen off. I don't know if this rings any bells to any of you. I'm not aware of that word, but this is how it's defined in the book. And this is, it is said in the dialect of Soran, and this was the nickname of the ancestor of the emirs of that dynasty. We have Rashik, black, in reference to Maulana Abdallah, who at the time was Mudaris of the Bitlis Madrasa of Idrisiya, and was known as Malay Rashik, the Black Mullah. And you also have the names of tribes and dynasties, like the Shambo of Hakkari, which are, according to Sharaf Khan, called that way because they restored their rule over the Hakkari Emirate on the same day. And he says this is a day that is called Shambo in the dialect of that people. We have the emirs of Soran, wherein Sharaf Khan says that Soran means the Reds, and it's a reference to the color of the stones which their warriors climbed to capture the fortress of Awan, and that would be why they got that name. We have the Bali of Ahmadiyya, about whom Sharaf Khan notes that the word Bal means valley in the idiom of the people of that country. Again, that's not a word that I'm aware of, but maybe some of you are. And we also have the Namiri, Namiran of Khizan, or so-called immortals. Should be, I guess, Namri, Namran. And that's a name stemming from the fact that after death of any one of their tribesmen, the governors of the emirate would continue paying his salary to his children. We also have the name, the Kurdish name, or the local name, according to Sharaf Khan, of the Khoshab River, which is called, according to him, Chame Mir Ahmed, the river of Mir Ahmed. And likewise, in the chapter on the already mentioned emirs of Khizan, he relays the townspeople's claim that the city's congregational mosque was constructed with wood from dog rose trees. And he adds, this is a tree called Idburnu by the Turks and Shilan by the Kurds. So in total, we have been able to identify 9 Kurdish words throughout the Sharafnāma. So this is a text of about 400 folios, so that's not much. And these are the Kurdish words that we have just discussed. And 8 of these words are actually used as part of proper names or nicknames in the text. Now, another important element of Sharaf Khan's discussion of Kurdish is constituted by his remarks on the language's phonological specificities, notably as seen in the adaptation of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish proper names to Kurdish pronunciation. So, for example, as an explanation for the shortening of the name of the emirs of Khizan from supposedly the Persian Sahar Khizan, meaning the ones rising before daybreak for prayer, because they were supposedly very pious, Sharaf Khan comments that eventually, as a result of frequent usage, the Kurds dropped the word Sahar and started saying only Khizan, as it is in their habit to shorten names such as Muhammad into Hamo, Shamsuddin into Shamo, and Izzuddin into Azo. And in later manuscripts, we also find Jamshid into Jamo, Abdal into Abdu. And this is, of course, something that is also known to us in contemporary times. The Kurdish author, however, is not necessarily consistent, as he had already noted only a few pages earlier that since the Kurds say Azazuddin or Azizuddin, I'm not really sure how we're supposed to vocalize that. For Azizuddin, the governors of Sasson are called Izazani, an argument to which a later reader, in fact, took exception in the margin of the Sharafnāma's autograph manuscript, as you can see here. Writing, this must be from a person named Azizuddin because Kurdish pronunciation removes syllables rather than adding them. This is a note from about the mid-17th century. Don't know who wrote, but it's quite interesting to have this opinion, which actually agrees with what Sharaf Khan was saying in the passage that we saw just before. Sharaf Khan gives other examples of such name changes, such as the Radikani tribe, which become Raikani when pronounced by Kurdish speakers, the Seljuk Malik Shah, supposedly ancestor of the emirs of Chamish Gezek, whose name would have been abbreviated as Malkish as a result of its frequent use by the Kurds. And finally, in a discussion of the spelling of the name of the Rojikid tribal confederation of Bitlis, Sharaf Khan remarks that the orthography with a jim comes from the rules of Arabic, with a j is from the rule of Persian, so Rojikid, and with a she would be more in line with the principles of Kurdish, so Roshkids. So this is what Sharaf Khan says. But he always writes Rojikids in his text. So even though it's not very numerous, I think this is a valuable linguistic and social linguistic evidence that is to be found in the Sharafnāma. And in addition, these comments on language on the part of Sharaf Khan also help us go further in our reflection upon the nature of the author's project, and more specifically, the readership he primarily wished to cater for. Indeed, the translation of basic Kurdish words, such as Sor, Rashik, or Shilan, would presumably have been superfluous to Kurdish speakers, including Sharaf Khan's fellow Kurdish emirs. And so it can safely be assumed that these translations were added for the benefit of non-Kurdish readers. And beyond this simple fact, Sharaf Khan clearly wrote these passages with a view to introducing his readership to remarkable and folkloric aspects of Kurdish life. And maybe this was not really visible here because I have not presented all the passages, it would have been too long, but this is always in the context of kind of funny anecdotes and not really like serious linguistic information. So if we keep in mind the author's conciliatory approach, towards the prejudiced view of the Kurds usually displayed by Arabic, Persian, and Turkish authors, we can argue that Sharaf Khan was, in the Sharafnāma, writing for a Persian Ottoman audience or for cultured Kurds like him, as much as he was writing for his fellow Kurdish emirs. And the circulation of Kurdish manuscript copies of the work in the 17th century actually attests to such a global readership, meaning that it was circulated both in Kurdish emirates, notably in Bitlis, the Ardalan Emirate, the Kilis Emirates, and others, and Palu Emirate, as mentioned, and also in the Ottoman and Safavid centers of power, namely Istanbul and Isfahan, and also other big centers like Aleppo, for example. And these notes also give us a little material to work with in our inquiry into Sharaf Khan's own linguistic abilities, a point that goes unmentioned in the author's autobiographical sketch. So we know for certain that Persian was his language of education and culture, as it had been his gateway to the arts and sciences. He writes his book in Persian, and in fact, almost all the sources used by the author in the Sharafnāma, whether poetry or prose, are Persian texts. It is also highly likely that Sharaf Khan, who was mostly brought up by his maternal family, spoke the Anatolian Turkish dialect of the Mosullu as his mother tongue. He also wrote in Turkish, at least a little, as he demonstrates by quoting poetry in the language, notably Kaside, praising Bitlisi resistance to the Akoyunlu, and the bilingual baits attributed to Suleiman I. So that means Sharaf Khan was bilingual in Turkish and Persian, which in 16th century Safavid Iran, and notably among military men, most of them Qızılbaş, would have been the rule rather than the exception. As far as Arabic is concerned, Sharaf Khan obviously had at least some command of the language, but the lack of mention of any Arabic sources in the text, except of course the Quran, raises the question of the extent to which he was actually comfortable using the language. So for example, the chapter on Ayyubid history is almost entirely taken from Khandemir, writing in Persian, where we would expect to have much more relevant information in Arabic sources, but these are not used by Sharaf Khan. And of course, coming to our main question, there is an even greater degree of uncertainty concerning Sharaf Khan's proficiency in Kurdish. Now, as a young emir educated outside Kurdistan, son of a Turkish mother and husband of a Turkish wife, his knowledge of Kurdish could only have developed from two sources. Number one, his father, Shamsuddin Khan, and number two, the members of the Rojikid tribe that went into exile with the both of them. Yet Sharaf Khan makes it clear in his autobiography that he was mostly estranged from his father, instead calling his maternal uncle and father-in-law, the Turkish-speaking Muhammed Beg Mosullu, a surrogate father, Pedar Menzilat. As for the Rojikids, Sharaf Khan likely did not interact with them much until about 1554, when he was first appointed as their commander at around 10 years old and sent to Shirvan under the guardianship of Sheikh Amir Bilbasi, which was a prominent figure in the Rojikid tribe. So during his years in Safavid service, Sharaf Khan was always accompanied by the Rojikids, but he was never posted in Kurdistan. And although his arrival in Bitlis at 35 years old in 1578 must have significantly increased his exposure to the Kurdish language, it is unknown if he ever became fluent in it. What the Sharafnāma tells us is that Sharaf Khan had at least some degree of knowledge of the language, and that he could mobilize this knowledge of Kurdish vocabulary and expressions for the purpose of inclusion in his book. Now, as a brief word of conclusion, it is worth mentioning here that Sharaf Khan's interest in language was not limited to Kurdish, and he entertains the reader with the definition of words taken from various idioms, namely Turkish, Armenian, Mongolian, and Hungarian, as well as transmitting information on Lurish, found in Hamdallah Mustafi Qazvini's Zubdatut Tawarikh. This is a mid-14th century work in Persian. Through the near constant attention paid to languages by its author, the Sharafnāma presents a striking picture of Kurdistan and the broader Turco-Iranian world as an environment of great linguistic diversity and coexistence, and it is in this respect perhaps pointless to dwell too much on the question of Sharaf Khan's own linguistic abilities in Kurdish. What is essential, I hope to have shown, is to consider how his upbringing and acculturation to the dominant Perso-Turkish culture led him to diffuse stereotypical views about the Kurds and their language via the Sharafnāma, and that he actually did so despite also doing his best to present the Kurds and their language in what he saw as a positive light. And I think this is a situation that could be extrapolated to many of the Kurdish emirs and could help us understand a lot of things about the socio-cultural context of the period in Kurdistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sacha. That was a great presentation. I am really amazed with it. The last one too. I just want to elaborate a couple of points that you mentioned. One of the things is that when you have been talking about these cultural zones, you know, Persian, Turkish, and partially Arabic and Kurdish, and it seems that these Kurdish notables like Idris Bitlisi too, and several others of his period, they have been, you know, roaming in these cultural zones and picking up with variety of you know, languages and studies, even professors that they choose and studied with them. So and it seems that he kind of separates himself from lay people of Kurdistan by showing his language skills through his works. I'm going to compare with today's world. I mean, most of the international scholars use English and try to show off with their, you know, language abilities when they write. So it seems maybe a similar case is there. And my second, I mean, related to that is my second comment and question would be, after all these years of, you know, being separate from his, you know, roots, living in another world and coming back and finally discovering his roots maybe, and then deciding to write Sharafnāma. I mean, how much it's related to his, you know, exposure to other cultures vis-a-vis Kurdish world. So I really wonder how that transformation took place later on. By the way, I took the freedom of asking the first question. I'm sorry. If you have any questions, please either post it or just raise your hand.
Yeah, thank you very much, Metin. Yeah, so in terms of showing off linguistic abilities, well, I think for him, growing up in Iran and being educated in a Shah's palace, really writing in Persian was the natural choice. Actually, I don't know if he could have written his text in any other language because, as I mentioned, he doesn't use Arabic sources. Actually, doesn't use any Turkish sources either, except from Hoja Sadeddin's Taj al-Tawarikh. So even if he probably spoke Turkish, as I said, probably as his native language, and he does write very little bits of Turkish in the text, I don't think he could have actually written the kind of Ottoman Turkish, flowery Ottoman Turkish of the period. And so, yeah, for him, I think it was in his vision of adab, Islamic adab, it was very natural to write in that language. And I don't think he would have even considered writing in Kurdish, right? As I tried to show in my talk, whenever he mentions Kurdish words, whatever, it is always spoken by tribesmen, always related to funny nicknames, plant names, things like that. So it is really about, yes, the life of the common people, the life of the society of which he and the other Kurdish emirs see themselves above that society, right? So I think this is one of the main reasons. And in a way, he looks at the Kurdish language, or we get this feeling reading the book, kind of as an outsider. It's like it's funny to him. It's a funny language with, you know, funny quirks and spoken by funny people. This kind of things. That's the impression that we get. As for the concept of him coming back and how much it influenced his writing of the Sharafnāma. So obviously this is hard to tell because we have very little information on Sharaf Khan's life, apart from actually almost no information on Sharaf Khan's life, apart from the Sharafnāma itself. But what is certain is that he starts writing, or at least he starts giving a real shape to this project. Maybe he took notes before, but he starts really embarking in this project after he's demoted from his position as Emir of Bitlis by the Sultan, by Mehmed III at the time. And so my feeling is that this is a way for him to assert his legitimacy as the Emir of Bitlis and to try and get back his position. And so the idea is to assert his legitimacy vis-a-vis the Sultan and vis-a-vis also the fellow Kurdish emirs. And the whole structure of the text, where you have this list of Kurdish emirates with a chapter on each emirate, which concludes with the emirs of Bitlis that have a whole book devoted to them, and then the autobiography of the author as the culminating point of that, really also gives that impression. So yeah, but of course, probably also had sort of personal motivations, that is for certain. And he does actually say in the preface that the idea of writing a history book on the Kurds occurred to him actually when he was still in Iran. So that is something that he mentions, but without really giving more details about it. So, but yeah, maybe the fact that being in foreign lands, far away from his emirate, and without knowing if he would ever be able to go back there, or not go back actually, because he was never there. So, but able to go there and reinstate the power of his ancestors, surely played a role, I think, in his decision to write the Sharafnāma. And I think it's not an accident that the only book about Kurdish history that we have at the time is written by someone who was in exile and was not born into the Emirates. I think there is definitely something at play here, but it's hard to say more without having more material to work with, of course.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I can ask a question.
Hello. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Sacha, for this interesting presentation. While talking about the phonology of Kurdish in Sharafnāma, you mentioned that Bitlisi mentions the names, and in some cases, he reduced some of those names. I was wondering if there is any like a phonological pattern in terms of those reductions. Can you observe in terms of, you know, like how those names were reduced? Is there any like a pattern you can observe? You know, like how those reductions were done. Do you have any observation about them, or?
Yeah, thank you very much. So it's hard to talk about a pattern because we really have very few examples. Actually, what I've mentioned is all the examples we have of this. But yeah, I think there are two things here at play. The first one is the kind of nickname reduction that's so Jamshid, Jamo, this sort of thing that he mentions that we still know today in Kurdish.
Right.
And then there is just the removal like of a syllable, like for example, Radikani becoming Raikani. I think this is also something that is very common in various languages. Yeah, but so this is not, anyways, this is not strange things. These are things that would be familiar to us from our knowledge of Kurdish today. But it is hard to say that there is a pattern there, I think.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Sirwan has a question. No, Muslimatin.
Yeah, I just said go ahead, Sirwan, but my voice was out. So go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is a very fascinating talk, actually. I appreciate that. I have a comment, and then Glory would be followed by a question regarding Sharafnāma, like or Sharaf Khan's, like Kurdish proficiency, I have a doubt that he didn't have like some Kurdish competency, since we know he was an Amir, like the son of Amir Shamsuddin, and we like as a Kurds, we know that the Kurdish Kurds, specifically Amir and Diwa Khana, was very rich in terms of cultural practice from many perspectives. And I assume he was so much exposed to, Kurdish Hayran or Kurdish culture and all the, proverbs, whatever, you name it. Probably he had, a very great, like a command of Kurdish. Then I would ask a question to like, we know that in Sharafnāma, Sharaf Khan makes several references about like a individual's name was referenced during the ceremony and Friday prayer, khutbah. So, that during that time, in order to, amirs to get legitimacy, they have to, their names, have to be, referenced during the khutbah, during the, prayer time, in the Friday prayer time. Then my question would be, have you observed any sense or like that, whether or not those khutbah, like Friday ceremonies, were delivered in Kurdish?
Well, thank you for the question. I think this is very hard to say, and I think this would also depend a lot on the context. What are we talking about? Are we in a village context, in an urban context, whatever? But yeah, I couldn't comment on that. It's very, very hard to say. It's possible, but it might be likely in some contexts, but I really can't say for sure. Concerning
From the,
yeah,
go ahead. From the Soran perspective, it was very late, like khutbah, like was delivered in Sorani, in Kurdish, like during the, late 20th century. So, but versus the Bakur, I wonder how was, khutbah was delivered. Did you like get any like sense from the context? Because he makes several references that several emirs were mentioned during the khutbah.
Yeah, this is a part of the division of books in the Sharafnāma. So the first book is devoted exclusively to what he calls independent rulers, and he specifically says rulers that had their names mentioned in the khutbah and that had coins minted in their names, which are the two, of course, symbols of independent rulership in the Islamic world. But he doesn't actually say like what the khutbah and what language the khutbah is or anything about that. And he never mentions in the work examples of khutbah being said or whatever. So yeah, I wouldn't know. I think we might have better luck on this topic looking at 19th century sources, which might say a bit more about that. But for that period, I don't think we have anything to go with. What we could say, and what I did mention, is that in the madrasa context, we do have the use of Kurdish from the 17th century onwards with texts, and we can assume that this develops from previous use of Kurdish orally. Like we can assume that the teachers would explain, especially to young children, the topics in Kurdish first, and this is how the didactical books written in Kurdish came to be. So there was a need for these books because you needed to explain these topics in Kurdish. So that is something I think we could say fairly certainly, at least. And regarding your comments concerning Kurdish proficiency, yes, it is sure that there was, I think, a high degree of Kurdish culture being produced including at the course of the Emirates, but I don't think all Emirates were necessarily equal in that regard. So the Emirate of Bitlis was not the Emirate of Jizre, for example, I think. And also what is important to remember is that Sharaf Khan was born in Qom in central Iran. He was mostly raised in his maternal family, which are Mosul Turks. Then he spent 3 years in the Shah's palace in Qazvin with the children of the Shah, Shah Tahmasp, educated in Persian. And then he acted as a Safavid commander in various places, accompanied by the Rojikids, so he might have been exposed to the Kurdish language there. But I think until he went to Bitlis when he was 35 years old in 1578, I think he wasn't much exposed to the Kurdish language. And in fact, if we look at the Sharafnāma by Evliya Çelebi, which discusses also the Emirate of Bitlis and Abdal Khan, which is the grandson of Sharaf Khan, you can see that there is not much Kurdish speaking mentioned in that part of the Sharafnāma, whereas Evliya Çelebi mentions Kurdish being spoken, being recited as poetry, etc. in many Emirates, but not so much in the Emirate of Bitlis. And actually, whenever he gives an example of what he calls the Kurdish dialect of the Rojikids, so the tribe of the Emirs of Bitlis, but it's actually a Turkish dialect. So again, we cannot extrapolate too much on that, but we could imagine that not only Sharaf Khan, but all these Rojikid men, which were the prominent men in the tribe, which also spent more than 30 years in Iran, we can also imagine that there was a loss of Kurdish competency there at some point, maybe, especially if they intermarried with other Kızılbaş groups and that sort of things, which we don't know, but which is also possible. So yeah, this is in that sense that I was making that comment. But again, these are all hypotheses because we have no idea of actually knowing that. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Welcome. Mr. Mujahid, go ahead.
Thank you. I thought language people will they should go first to ask questions. Thank you, Sacha, for a very interesting, a very informative presentation. There is a lot to discuss, and it's open to a further conversation. But what got my attention most is the fact that looking back retrospectively, we tend to kind of invest too much linguistic claim in Kurdishness because Kurdishness could be secured by someone like Sharaf Khan through his dynastic, identity, ethnic identity of Kurdishness could find its expression comfortably in Persian, Turkish, or at times Kurdish, but maybe class or nobility concerns override linguistic concerns. For contemporary society, of course, if you are Kurd, you should value Kurdish and so on. But for a society of the time, that might not be the case. And so I see some of that kind of leading some of the disagreements. The other thing is the fact that this 17th century turn from Persian to Ottoman Turkish, like from the Persianate sphere to Ottoman Turkic sphere, it kind of creates a new zone, a climate for Kurdish identity, because if you are totally dominated by Persian culture, you are likely to be assimilated. You can see it and you take position according to that. But once you are released from it and you are in between, that kind of liminal back and forth reinforces distinctiveness of Kurdish identity. So that's something I thought that should be highlighted. If you have any comments, I would appreciate. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. So yeah, concerning the second point, I think we can also add that the fact that Ottoman Turkish is a lot less prestigious than Persian is. So this, I think, also opens that avenue for Kurdish at that time in Ottoman Kurdistan, because the correspondence with, of course, the Ottoman Central Power is still done in Ottoman Turkish, but in the realm of literature and didactic texts, religious texts, then you have a new avenue that opens for Kurdish, because Persian is not really a suitable medium anymore because it's not well understood by even the literate people. And Ottoman Turkish is not really a literary language of Kurdistan, so at the time. And so this is how I think Kurdish can find the space to exist at that time. And concerning your first comments, yes, of course, I think the question of class is very important here. I mean, Sharaf Khan writes his book and he presents himself in his book as sort of the leader of the emirs of Kurdistan. I had done this survey some time ago. I never actually published it, but how many times the words Kurd, Kurdistan appear in the work? I don't have the numbers in my head now, but it's about 150 times. And 90% of those times, the word Kurdistan appears as part of Umarai Kurdistan, Hukam Kurdistan, Hakimani Kurdistan, so the governors of Kurdistan, the emirs of Kurdistan, etc. So this is really the prominent group that is featured in the Sharafnāma. That is also the preeminent audience for the book, in addition to the Ottoman central authorities, I think. And so Sharaf Khan sort of tries to paint himself as the leader of that group. And so in a way, you have this double Kurdish identity, the identity of the emirs on the one hand, and the identity of the rest of the people, the tribesmen, etc., on the other hand. And of course, he will see that identity of the tribesmen as something less refined, something, the stuff of ignorant people. And the Kurdish language is associated to, in his mind, I think, at least in the text, to that identity. And this is something that we find actually, if we talk about the Turkish language as well, because, for example, we know that the Ottomans also regard the Turks, what they call the Turks, as, like Sharaf Khan regards the Kurds, as ignorant, irrational people. And you can find that in a lot of texts. The Atrak are always denigrated, negatively identified in Ottoman texts. And you find that, for example, in Evliya's, Çelebi's Sharafnāma, you have the Akrad Div Nahad, so the demon-like Kurds, but you have the Atraki Napak, the impure Turks, for example. And so this is about the same, because you have this Ottoman language, and which has taken in a lot of Persian words, etc., has become sort of a literary language. And then you have the Turkish language, which is, of course, very different. But the difference here is that in the case of Kurdish, at least in Sharaf Khan's vision, you don't have that literary Kurdish. But in fact, as we have seen, it is in the process of being created, or it is, I guess, the project that somebody like Ahmed Khani has when he writes Memuzin. Yeah. So I think we can make that parallel here.
Excellent. We are at the end of our session, I believe. I don't know if we can have maybe one more question, if there is anyone else. Okay, if not, then well, I'd like to thank you very much again, Sacha, for such a great presentation and great discussion to the speaker, I mean the audience. I really appreciate, and I'm hoping to see you again in our next speakers, Jin Bajalan of Missouri State University. Have a great evening to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Happy
Bye.
Nowruz.
Happy Nowruz.
Happy Nowruz.